Okay, let's dive into this. If you get sick today, the solution is usually pretty simple, right? You just pop over to the pharmacy, grab a pill, maybe a cream, but man, it took us a very long time to get here. For most of history, medicine was just pure trial and error. And as you're about to see, there was a whole lot of error.
So just think about a common cough. For you, the answer is probably a cough drop or some syrup. No big deal. But just a few generations back, the solution was, well, it was something else entirely. They were basically just throwing things at the problem, hoping something would stick. And what they finally landed on is going to blow your mind.
And yep, you're seeing that correctly. At one point in time, the go-to medicine for a simple cough was heroin. This is just our first stop on a wild tour of some of the most bizarre and frankly terrifying cures in history. The kind of stuff that will make you so grateful for modern science. So we're kicking things off with a whole category of cures that were, in and of themselves, poisons and really dangerous substances. I mean, these were the early days of pharmaceuticals, where chemists were finding these powerful compounds, but had absolutely zero idea what the long-term effects were.
The backstory here is just fascinating. Heroin was actually developed in Germany by the pharmaceutical giant Bayer, and they marketed it, completely seriously, as a cough suppressant. But the real kicker, the height of irony, is that they sold it as a non-addictive alternative to morphine. Now, look, saying something is less addictive than morphine is already a pretty low bar, but even then, they were just catastrophically wrong. It was sold over the counter for years before doctors started to realize how incredibly dangerous it was, and by the early 1900s, its use was finally and severely restricted.
All right, next up we've got another famous one, chloroform. You probably know it as the thing that knocks people out in old black and white movies, but it was once a super popular surgical anesthetic. It got this huge boost in popularity after it was given to Queen Victoria during childbirth. And hey, after 9 kids, who could blame her? But its use didn't stop there. Doctors used it for pretty much everything: asthma, cholera, even gonorrhea. It was even used as a sweetener for other medicines. I guess a spoonful of chloroform helps the medicine go down, right? It wasn't until there was this big spike in sudden deaths during surgery that its popularity thankfully faded.
Okay, so if you thought the chemical cures were bad, you might want to brace yourself, because we are now entering the world of so-called natural remedies, where the cures came directly from the human body. And this is where things go from being just a little misguided to truly bizarre.
So let's play a little game. Picture this. It's the 1600s. You've got a splitting headache. What do you think the doctor orders? Some herbal tea? Maybe a nap? Nope. The prevailing medical wisdom pointed to something a bit more personal.
The answer was medical cannibalism. You heard me right. For centuries in Europe, consuming human remains was a surprisingly common medical practice. The thinking was sort of like a twisted form of magic. A powdered skull could cure a headache, and drinking fresh blood could fix blood diseases. People would literally, and I mean literally, line up at public executions to get a cup of warm blood. One doctor even suggested that jerky made from the flesh of red-headed men could treat all sorts of ailments. So the question wasn't if you should eat people, but which part of which person was going to work best.
And from one bodily fluid, we move right on to the next. Let's talk about urasia, or, as it's better known, urine therapy. This is the practice of drinking your own urine for its supposed health benefits. And this wasn't just some fringe idea. It was used in a lot of ancient civilizations. Get this. Ancient Roman dentists apparently used urine as a mouthwash to whiten teeth. I can only imagine the pranks they pulled on their patients. And what did people think urine could cure? Basically everything. The list is endless, from asthma to cancer. The practice actually got a modern boost in the early 20th century from a British naturopath who claimed he cured himself by fasting for 45 days on nothing but his own urine and tap water. And here's the wildest part. Unlike medical cannibalism, urine therapy is still practiced in some parts of the world today, even though countless studies have shown it has zero benefits and carries some pretty significant health risks.
All right, we've covered poisons, we've covered bodily fluids. Now we move on to the most extreme category, the cures that were so drastic they were often just as deadly as the disease itself. This was the medical equivalent of fighting a fire with a much bigger fire.
Just take the historical treatment for syphilis. In the early 20th century, a doctor named Julius Wagner-Jauregg had this absolutely wild idea. He thought he could cure the psychosis caused by late-stage syphilis by intentionally giving patients another deadly disease, malaria. His logic? The the super high fever from the malaria would just cook the syphilis bacteria to death. Then he'd just cure the malaria with quinine. Simple. The only tiny problem was hoping the patient actually survived the whole ordeal. And for this, he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927. No joke.
So this number, it tells a really crucial part of the story. Wagner Jauregg wasn't totally wrong. The procedure had about a 25% success rate. But let's be crystal clear about what that means. For the other 75%, the treatment was either useless or they died from the malaria they were deliberately given. It was an incredible gamble. And then, just 1 year after he won the Nobel Prize, penicillin was discovered, making the entire horrifying procedure obsolete overnight. The flawed logic back then could be truly mind-boggling. Take rabies. One of its most famous symptoms is hydrophobia, this intense fear of water. So ancient doctors thought, aha, exposure therapy. Their solution was to repeatedly submerge rabies victims, basically dunking them over and over, hoping that forcing them to take in water would flush the disease out. They didn't really get the difference between swallowing and inhaling. The result? Well, the cure was usually just drowning. I suppose, technically, the victim no longer suffered from rabies.
And for our last stop in this lovely section, we turn to the father of medicine himself, Hippocrates, and his recommended treatment for hemorrhoids. The cure was simple. You take a red-hot iron and you shove it up there to burn them off. But it's his specific instructions that are the stuff of nightmares. He wrote that the patient should be held down and made to scream because their cries would cause the rectum to project more, making it an easier target. Can you even imagine going to the doctor for a common problem and ending up being branded like cattle while being told to scream louder? Okay, so far, these cures have all been dead ends, ideas that were thankfully completely abandoned. But our final example is different. It's one of the oldest and most brutal procedures you can imagine, yet it has a direct and really surprising link to modern life-saving neurosurgery.
Let's talk about trepanning, the practice of drilling a hole in someone's skull. We have evidence this has been happening for at least 10,000 years. Originally, it was probably a spiritual ritual. If someone was acting erratically, the belief was they were possessed by evil spirits, and drilling a hole would let those spirits out. In what might be the most metal thing I've ever heard, the patient would sometimes keep the piece of bone that was removed and wear it as a charm to ward off any future possessions. But here's the crazy twist. Today, a version of this, called a craniotomy, is a critical procedure used to relieve pressure on the brain after a serious injury. The principle is the same, open the skull. But thankfully, we now have anesthesia and incredible surgical precision. You know, when you look back at all of this, it's just so clear. The journey to the effective, regulated, and relatively painless medicine we have today was paved with some truly horrific ideas. From poisons and cannibalism to fire and disease, our ancestors endured treatments that were often way worse than the illness itself. It really makes you appreciate the scientific method, clinical trials, and, maybe above all else, anesthesia.
And that brings us to one last thing to think about. Looking back at these cures feels absurd, right? It's almost comical in how horrifying it is. But it leaves us with this fascinating question. What widely accepted medical treatments that we use today will future generations look back on with that exact same shock and disbelief? What's going to be the heroin for a cough of our era? It's a pretty humbling thought, and it reminds us that the story of medicine is always evolving.